welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jen, and I am joined by who is now I consider a friend of the show. If you've been here twice, you are a friend of the show, who is here to talk about a fantastic book that I literally just finished right before we started recording, and I am so amped for this. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. My name is Rick Paulas, and I am a writer slash bartender slash journalist, I suppose, based in Greenpoint, Brooklyn right now. And the book is MALINKO, which is let's see if I can get the tagline right after posting it thousands of times. A thriller about a newlywed couple on a Route 66 honeymoon who stumble upon a mysterious radio show. There we go. And that's kind of it.
It's such a great ride. And, you were here last time to talk about The Lady in Greenpoint, which is a really beautiful ghost story walking tour of Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And I really loved that. And I loved Palmer Hotel. And so before we get into MALINKO itself, all your stuff has like a really is really grounded in a very strong sense of place. Is that something that's like particularly interesting for you when you write?
I definitely think it's become that. I didn't like seek out that. I think from the start, it was more like, and like I think about this back to sort of the first book that I did, Eastern Span, which is that was a noir that was set amongst sort of like the housing crisis and homelessness in Oakland, California. That was based around a lot of like reporting that I did at the time. And so it was basically like I was on a beat that was covering housing and homelessness throughout the Bay Area, as sort of my central focus for that era of my journalism. And so I just wrote a fictional story that was set in a lot of like real places or places that were inspired by real places and things like that, and try to like pay like really close attention to, if like the main character is taking a right down Telegraph, they should be taking a left at 41st Street and things like that were just kind of like based on, again, just kind of walking the neighborhood, biking the neighborhood, driving the neighborhood, and just trying to really kind of pay close attention to the geographical, like realism of the place. And so I think from there, it kind of, I kind of just had that in my mind for how to make something. And so then Palmer Hotel was like, well, the first thing I need to do is map out this hotel just to make sure that I know where the things take place in, as opposed to kind of like starting with a character or starting with even a plot. It's really just, I got to start with the place first. And then from there, I could fill it in kind of like like a Playhouse style thing of like, you have your structure of like the fairy castle or whatever, and then you have your dolls and you play with inside the structure. But the structure is sort of the thing that, to me at least, is like the first most important thing. And then once I kind of grasp my like, the concept around where it can take place and sort of what the limits of those places are, then my characters can kind of, play within them and maybe extend the limits depending on what happens. So.
Very cool. And so did you like sort of map out the town of MALINKO in a similar way?
Yeah, for sure. And like this was the thing with MALINKO, and I don't know if this it's sort of in the start of the book a little bit, but this was a very long process. This was like a 20-year long process. And so it started as a screenplay that I wrote when I first moved from Chicago to LA it must have been 2003, 2004, something like that. And then throughout the years, I would kind of pick it up again, be like, all right, I want to do this, I want to do that. And then after writing Eastern Span and Palmer Hotel, I was kind of like, oh, I know how to make a book. Like I know how to physically like do the act of like this number of words will lead to a book. I could send it to this printer and he could make a book. So I was like, all right, let's go back to Palmer Hotel, do it up again. And so I think so I guess to answer a long way to answer your question is that there's been a number of maps of Malinko over the years, and it has changed a few times. And I think one of the reasons I like the other books that I've done have included a map, and Malinko did not. And I think part of that was just because I wanted the reader to kind of like figure it out themselves somewhat, and also because it has been this sort of like mysteriously moving place throughout the years, because I would change like what was across the street from what and that type of thing. And so I just wanted to kind of give it a little haziness, I suppose, as opposed to like a clarity that would come with more of like a mapped out actually specific thing. But yeah, so I do have a map for sure. I have a map like drawn of like where everything is, but I just didn't, it's not like fleshed out, I guess.
Oh, nice. So tell us a little bit about our protagonists, if you will, Alicia and Luke. They're on this road trip on Route 66. I'd love for you to talk about them and maybe like what drew you to sort of like the Route 66, like legend and mythos, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. That was so yeah, again, that was based somewhat on the first road trip I did from Chicago to LA to move out there. Um was not along Route 66. It was me and my girlfriend at the time drove out there, and that was the sort of just the genesis of like, oh, a couple moving out, and like and just kind of their dynamic and things like that. Um but it wasn't until I moved from uh, Oakland to New York, and I drove across country with my dad, who had flown out and driven with me, and we did Route 66 for pretty much most of the way. That it was kind of like, oh, this is a lot of the dynamics that I was trying to deal with, in terms of just like, the economy moving away from somewhere, and radio broadcasts in the middle of nowhere, that type of thing. Just kind of like evocative kind of things that I was drawn to. It's like, oh, a lot of this stuff is already captured in Route 66. And so I just like, and there's really no reason not to kind of like move the actual um the route, I guess, from like, because the first one I did was from Chicago to LA, and so I think it was more like a northern route for some reason, even though you could take Route 66, that still felt a little bit out of the way. But heading back, I don't know, just there was something about the almost like a Gothic Americana that was still in existence in Route 66 as you're going through, because you have all these towns that used to be just economic drivers in a way that now, you just see like the skeletal structures still existing, and you still see some of like, the motels that are fallen in disrepair and things like that. And so it just felt like hit it, like as we were driving through, I was like, oh no, I like this is where it has to be set. And so I just kind of shifted a few things over, then did a lot more, yeah, historical research, I suppose, on Route 66, and kind of was able to embed that in through this like final round of drafts and stuff like that. Yeah, does that answer? I don't know if that answers.
Totally. Yeah,
Okay.
it reminded me that your work also has like a really strong sense of history, because the Lady in Greenpoint has like a lot of like local Brooklyn history that you kind of learn along the way too, and you learn stuff about monuments and buildings. And your point is really good that, like, yeah, we talk about like ghost towns along like routes that used to be sort of economic throughways that have died out. But there's also like haunted media in this book. So
Mm.
talk a little bit about the confessional, and sort of like how you shaped that. Like what drew you to sort of this like ghostly type radio show?
I mean, yeah. So the original impetus for that was definitely like, long drives uh through the American Southwest. Like, I sure on the way from Chicago to LA, but more so like when I was in LA, kind of doing these, long sort of just desert. You're just always in a car in LA, and so you're always tuning into different stations. And this was this was definitely pre iPod. This was like CDs and radio, I think, was the only thing that we had at that point. And so you tune in. I mean, the famous show, of course, is Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. That was the main one that I would listen to. And so like hearing his spooky gravelly voice and stuff like that in the middle of the night, was just a very like yeah, that was just a striking thing I always wanted to kind of capture. Um, and then, kind of again, like writing the start of this in 2003 to finishing it in, 2024 essentially has been a total shift in like media and how media works, and there's something about, the original radio broadcast I wanted to kind of hone in on, but also kind of use it in a way to somewhat, yeah, not describe as much as try to like puzzle through my feelings of sort of where we're at in this current media environment and stuff like that. And so, like, whenever, yeah, I think, at least for me, like any good piece of art doesn't have like answers. At least for me, like I don't have great answers in terms of like what I'm trying to do with like the radio show and things like that, as much as like these are puzzles I'm trying to like figure out. And I think I'm getting closer with each new piece towards like what I feel is actually happening in our current media like ecosystem, and kind of like, being on a Zoom call right now with you, and like being able to put out a podcast, and like to a global society, and like what that means, as opposed to 20 years ago, being the extensions that you had were only like limited by how big your radio antenna was, and sort of who was tuned in at that moment. And they were only able to tune in that exact moment, because you couldn't like time shift in terms of like when you can seek out your media and when you could hear it. So I don't know. These are all things that I'm kind of constantly obsessed with now. And so this radio show and the confessional, things like that, were all just kind of ways to somewhat tweak those things and try to figure out sort of what I think is happening, which again, I don't have a great answer for, but maybe after another like 5 or 6 books or a few more radio plays, I'll get closer to something that I feel, that I can be like, oh, this is actually what's happening.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because it is like, the show feels like, and any sort of like one of those late night local type shows that you happen to tune into on a drive, like feel like relics of a time like before monoculture, like, and when you could access things whenever you want, because there is a sort of, there was like a ritual and a community aspect to like everybody you knew kind of like tuning into the same thing at the same time and getting to talk about it later. And, like that has sort of been taken from us in a lot of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, though I would say like the one story I always come back to, and this was before my time, but it was the story I remember reading, and it was whenever the MASH finale was, the TV show MASH, and it was just that the story was that the New York City, like sewage pipelines were so flooded after the finale that they had to they had things broke, because everyone was like holding it to go to the bath, like they just wanted to see the finale, and then everyone just went to the bathroom at the exact same time. And there's something about that like that was always like very striking to me. It was like all these people are just like sitting watching the exact same thing at the exact same moment. They're sharing this exact same experience that now is pretty much completely lost, unless you're talking about the Super Bowl or something like that, like a live performance in some capacity. But that always felt like a very magical kind of instantly shared experience that has been lost for the most part. And back in the day, it was like the radio shows. You'd have people sitting around their little their their speakers, and they'd have the FDR like fireside chats and things like that. And so I always felt, I don't know, there was something about that still feels like really kind of magical to me, that we're losing, and pros and cons with all that stuff, but it's something that I just am always attracted to, I guess.
Yeah, it sort of has like this feel of like it can take you out of time too, I think, when you like happen upon like a certain type of show like that. Like reading this and reading about like, the confessional coming up on their radios in the car, in their hotel room, and then being drawn into this thing. It reminded me of like a very specific experience of, and this places it so specifically in time, of like driving back from my best friend's house in the early 2010s, like from watching Walking Dead on a Sunday night.
Mm-hmm.
Every drive home, I would listen to this radio show on FUV that played like 30s standards and like jazz and stuff like that. And it was also tinny because it was the old recordings, and I had this old guy who was presenting it to you. And it was so easy to pretend that like I was the only person hearing that, and it was like a ghost transmission from like somewhere weird, and like I think that like the confessional captures that feel of like being kind of unstuck in time too.
Yeah, no, there is something about the analog. I guess I don't even know if this is the correct way to say it, but just like the analog delivery of like the signals. And so you do have like, I have a little radio transmitter I've been kind of like trying to mess with and stuff now. And like, just putting like doing some little small transmission from my apartment and seeing how far like I could take the car to see where it like actually stops like tuning in and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, there's something super, I don't know, there's something super weirdly magical about that. The actual like signals bouncing through the waves of like that back in the day they called ether and stuff like that, whatever. But like as opposed to the signal being just boosted through the internet, I guess. Like there is a different feel to it and a different vibe to it. I mean, I know, I'm a big Twin Peaks The Return guy or whatever. I've seen it probably like 6 or 7 times now. And like there's that thing where like you have the old radio broadcast and the guy, and it's like there is something weird about that, like the extension of the signal that but through the actual atmosphere as opposed to whatever, evil internet stuff that we're dealing with now. That feels again just that I don't know, something like there's something special about that I think that we've kind of lost, I suppose.
Mm. I'm so glad that you brought up Twin Peaks: The Return, because it felt like very Lynchian to me at times too, and especially the way that you portray Malenko as like this sort of like classic like alienated suburbia type thing that like looks really appealing on the surface but has some sort of like insidiousness going on as well. Um, is Lynch like a conscious inspiration for you? Like what's in your like your horror and storytelling DNA?
I mean, I'm definitely influenced by a lot of Lynch for sure. Like in terms of just, um, yeah. I mean, like I think he's one of those filmmakers who it took me a little bit to tap into. Like Blue Velvet was really easy for me to get into, but a lot of his other movies, like even Lost Highway and Mulholland, like were, and even actually even the original Twin Peaks, like run was kind of just like I was like, all right, I don't know, he's just being weird for weird's sake or something like that.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, here's a little bit of a story. So I was when I was in LA, my boss at the time, as we were leaving for work, was like, "Hey, do you want to be an extra in a David Lynch movie?" And I was like, "Sure, that sounds great." And so he was making Inland Empire at the time, which the process of that was really kind of interesting in terms of it was all shot on like digital video, and he was kind of like it was like I want to say 2005 or so, and he was filming everything basically on a handheld like digital video camera. Um, and he spent about 2 years, doing waking up, doing his transcendental meditation thing, being like, I have a scene, and then they would shoot it that night. And so they would basically be like, running around for a few hours to try to get whatever scene he had in his head to film that night. And then after about 2 years of that, the third year, he kind of was like, all right, I think this is the thing. I think I know what I'm doing here. I'm going to actually like write a script and fill out these other things to kind of make it more of a coherent thing. But so I was brought in, or not brought in, I was an extra during the first 2 years where he was just kind of like making, just images essentially. And so I did get to see it. Like I got to see him work in the room of maybe 20 people in this like bar set in downtown LA. And it was just, and it was only maybe 2 hours or so, but like that was, then I was like, oh, I think I know, like this is very inspirational. Like I understand, like that's like, I'm seeing him work, I'm seeing him do his stuff, and then like reading about it and kind of seeing the final product. I think that whole thing for me is like the inspiration that I get from him of just kind of like, um, the images after the fact are everyone has their own, everyone will make their own thing, but like the actual, and he's very generous with this in interviews and stuff of like how he works, and like he doesn't talk about what it means and stuff, but he talks about like the process. And so I'm very much drawn to interviews of, like by him over the past years of like how the process works. And so I would say like that to me is like a very inspirational thing, and like seeing him work, seeing him like utilize new media and all sorts of media and like this and now I'm getting like on like a rant on David Lynch, but just like how different forms of media influence other forms of media. So he'll be painting a picture, and then he'll be like, all right, this I'm going to make an album that's sort of based on this, and I'm going to make like a film that's based on this thing, and kind of how it all like how if you when you start to work into different types of mediums, how they can start to bounce off each other in a way that then there just becomes a clarity of sort of where you're going for. And you don't have to be stuck in like, all right, I'm just a cartoon artist. I'm just like a writer. I'm just a whatever. It's kind of a way to fill the whole I don't know, to kind of like explore the different corners of things through different types of media so that at the end of the day you'll have like a very strong sense of what you're trying to create, I suppose. So I don't know. That's a long answer for that.
Well, I'm
But
always here for a rant about David Lynch. That's like, and I never really thought of it that way, but you're right that he's like extremely open about his like process, and completely closed about like what it means. And I do really like that because it's like, no, that's your job. You're watching it, you figure it out, like
Exactly. Yeah, no. Yeah, and like his stuff about process, I think is always very like there's some quote he's given about like someone's like, how do you make a movie? And he's like, well, you get it. I don't know if the number's right, but he's like, you get 82 cue cards and you write an idea on those cue cards. And once you fill out the cue cards, then you have a movie. And it's just like, and there's like, that's like again, I think just the most like generous thing any like filmmaker has ever said in terms of like how to actually make a movie is like it's not first of all it's not hard, anyone can do it, and it takes down the process in terms of like instead of being this like weird mystery, it's like no, you just like do this thing and then you make the thing, and that's all that at the end of the day it is. And here's like a quick tip towards getting you to that, as opposed to like getting just too involved in like I don't know different types of like this is how you work with the actors, this is how you work with the blah, this is how you get the funding, which is all very important, but really is sort of it's not irrelevant. It's just like anyone can make anything these days. Everyone has the tools to do stuff, and so then it just depends on like how willing you are to kind of like just do it kind of on your own. I don't know, like that's like the stuff that I've been doing with like this and like even Palmer Hotel and like Malinko and like Late in Greenpoint to a certain extent, like whenever people ask me like how I did it, I am very happy to talk them through like the specifics of sort of the thing, because I think that at the end of the day, any type of art is supposed to be inspirational to get other people to make art. I guess like like the way that I see it is the way that I sort of see journalism too. In a way, it's just kind of like you are around for a very limited amount of time, and your goal should be to like it's like a big soccer field and you should be getting a pass and kicking it up to the next person and whatever that means. And so like and that's the only job that any of us should sort of have, is like to kick it out to the next person and then hopefully they take it and score a goal or whatever the hell, right?
that's lovely. Yeah, I totally agree. And there's something like, not to get totally cheesy, but like very empowering in that, I think, not just for like filmmakers who like for whom it's or writers, for whom it makes it very accessible and possible seeming, because so much of like making art is mystified and like sacred in a way that like and this makes it accessible and sort of seem possible. But also like refusing to assign meaning to your work, I think like empowers readers and viewers, because it's like your reading of it is just as valid as mine is as the creator. Does that make sense?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I like there's certain things that people have questions about that I will be like, "Oh, well, you should reread this part," or something like that. Or there's certain things that like they caught me on like a plot hole that I'm like, "Oh, well, it's just in there somewhere," or whatever. Um, but in terms of meaning, in terms of things like that, like I still don't. I have my own interpretation to a certain extent of things. And again, like I was talking about, there's like these puzzles that I'm trying to figure out through the act of like creating art and through the act of like publishing, that are sort of like, these murky areas of what media means and how it works and things like that, and how these, radio shows work, and how they affect brains, how they affect people. I don't have like full answers to those questions, nor maybe do they exist.
Mm.
And so I think I have my own personal opinions and my own like ways towards what I believe is happening, but the best I can do is kind of this piece. Like there was, and I don't know if it's like a Lynch piece, but it's kind of like, or a Lynch quote, but there is the thing of like, well, I made the like, they're like, can you tell us about this movie? It's like, well, I made the movie. That's me telling you what I'm thinking. Like that's my communication along that. I'm not going to say more about it because I made the movie. If I could talk about it, I would have talked about it, but instead I've made this instead, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. I like letting the art speak for itself and sort of not elaborating beyond that. I think this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for coming back to join us again and for sharing your book with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again. This is incredible. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. What's on the horizon for you? Are you writing anything fiction wise right now or
Yeah, so the next thing is gonna be another walking audio story. Um and so that I got a grant through the Brooklyn Arts Council based on the Lady in Greenpoint to do another walking audio story. This one is going to be set throughout Prospect Park. And so I've been going there almost once a week to kind of walk it. I have I have a good skeletal structure of sort of what the story is and how it's gonna be, how it's gonna work. Unlike like Lady in Greenpoint was very much like one specific pathway that you listen to, and this one I think is going to be a little more choose your own adventure kind of thing. So a little more sprawly. And then, yeah, I started recording stuff, but mostly I'm still in the writing phase now, and hopefully by the end of next year I'll have something. But this is a long this is going to be a long process. So every time I like go to write, I'm like, oh, come up with another idea that I'm like, oh, this is going to take maybe a little longer than I had hoped. But that's the next thing. That's for sure going to be like that's what I'm focusing all the energy on right now.
nice? Well, I'm extremely excited for that. So Godspeed. I hope it goes well.
Thank you.
Can't wait to listen. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right, listeners, please check out Malinko. It's so great. And also check out The Lady in Greenpoint too. It's so beautiful. Listen to that episode again. It's really good. You can get Malinko on your website, right?
Yeah, the best way to do it. That reminds me to update my website. But yeah, you could Venmo me. It's $25. If you live around Brooklyn and want to stop into the bar, and just or meet me somewhere, then it's $20. And Venmo is Rick-Paulus, or you could PayPal me, rickpaulus@gmail.com, or find me on Twitter, Rick Paulus. Find me on Blue Sky now. Everyone's moving to Blue Sky. So I'm around. Yeah, there's just contact me. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Oh, what a great way to get a book too. Very personal sort of transaction. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.